Welcome to Perlman Quadrangle and Irvine Auditorium. Irvine Auditorium is a non-smoking facility. Restrooms are located on the lower and second balcony levels. Vending machines and payphones are located only on the lower level. Assisted listening devices are available upon request. Please take time to note the exit clearly marked at the front and rear of the auditorium. If for some reason there is an emergency, please use these exits to vacate the building in an orderly fashion. For your safety and the safety of others, after exiting, please move away from the building as far as possible. Cameras or recording devices are not permitted in the auditorium. Please take the time now to silence all cell phones or beepers for thorough enjoyment of today's presentation by yourself and others.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's program. Please welcome Director of Perry Worldhouse, Professor Bill Burke-White.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. Buenas tardes y bienvenidos. Welcome to the inaugural Penn-Biden Leaders Dialogue and the culmination of the Perry Worldhouse Fall Colloquium on the future of the global order in an era of populism, nationalism, and retrenchment. Today, we also celebrate the one-year anniversary of the grand opening of Perry Worldhouse and a year of programming that has elevated Penn's global engagement. We gather now for the culmination of a fascinating day of conversations with senior military officials, global economic leaders, and journalists from around the world, and soon, two of the world's truly greatest leaders and thinkers. To begin that program, it is my honor to introduce the person who has made all of this possible, the visionary who has charted Penn's global future, the innovator who founded both Perry Worldhouse and the Penn-Biden Center for Global Engagement, the thinker whose insights on deliberative democracy are so urgently needed around the world today, the 8th President of the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Amy Gutmann.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bill. It's wonderful to see you all here for this very exciting occasion. So it's often been said in international affairs that if you're not seated at the table, then most likely you're on the menu. So today, we are extremely fortunate to welcome two renowned international leaders whose careers have been absolutely committed to taking others off the menu and adding more seats to the table. And don't we need that today? I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this inaugural Penn-Biden Global Leaders Dialogue. The Penn-Biden Center is focused on diplomacy, foreign policy, and national security. It serves as the perfect complement to Perry Worldhouse, whose one-year anniversary we are celebrating today. We set out to bring Penn to the world and the world to Penn. Through the outstanding leadership of Bill Burke-White, together with an enormously talented and energetic staff at Perry Worldhouse, amazing faculty, and students who have found Perry Worldhouse to be the go-to place any time of the day to engage with world affairs, we have done just that and so much more. Perry Worldhouse is the locus of scholarly inquiry, multidisciplinary collaboration, student research, and transcultural dialogue. More than that, it's a place to drop in for coffee, for conversation, and exposure to new people and new thoughts about global affairs and ideas. The building and center are everything that Richard and Lisa Perry hoped and dreamed when they made their transformative gift. Let's give a big round of applause to Bill Burke-White, the people at Perry Worldhouse, and Lisa and Richard Perry. This afternoon's inaugural Penn-Biden Global Leaders Forum is truly the icing on the birthday cake. As Vice President Biden never tires of reminding us, great nations like Mexico and the United States do not lead by the example of their power. Instead, they lead by the power of their example. They lead by demonstrating their commitment to freedom and diversity, to inclusivity and toleration, to mutual respect and the rule of law. More than anything, great leadership comes through caring. If I may just take a moment, I want to salute the leadership shown by our own Penn students in this regard. Acting quickly and decisively, they have responded to the heartbreaking images coming to us from Mexico after the earthquake. They have mobilized to raise funds in support of relief efforts there. Our hearts, our thoughts, our prayers are with the people of Mexico. They are a resilient and strong and creative and innovative people. They are our friends and neighbors. The people of Puerto Rico, nations across the Caribbean who are confronting natural disasters. We salute them, we care for them, and I'm so pleased to know that our students have risen to the effort. This is a very important time that tests our resolve to help our friends and our fellow human beings. It's my honor now to introduce two outstanding leaders who have spent their lives in public service displaying amazing, important leadership. It is really our honor to have them here at the University of Pennsylvania. We honor Joe Biden as our Benjamin Franklin Presidential Practice Professor and dear friend. In his career as United States Senator from the state of Delaware, he was a prominent member and former chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. And as you know, he was often considered the third senator from Pennsylvania, and we'll take that too. As a two-term vice president of the United States, he actively helped shape and guide U.S. foreign policy. He worked with and so often befriended foreign leaders the world over. In fact, he probably has befriended more foreign leaders in his time in government than any other living American. One of these leaders is our very special guest for this inaugural Penn-Biden Global Leaders Dialogue. Felipe Calderon served as president of Mexico from 2006 to 2012. He is both a lawyer and an economist by training. He is enormously insightful on the affairs of Mexico and on world affairs. Although faced with an international economic calamity that began here in the United States but soon echoed around the world, President Calderon kept a single-minded focus on bettering the lives of ordinary Mexicans. He oversaw passage of legislation to reform Mexico's judicial system. He worked to strengthen the energy sector, increase the number of jobs, and fight crime and drug cartels. Through much of his term of office, he worked closely with the Obama administration and Vice President Biden to further expand the close and neighborly relations between Mexico and the United States. These are two very special leaders. We have a tremendous amount to learn from them both, and to have them both in dialogue with one another is a true treat. So please join me in giving our warmest Penn welcome to Vice President Joe Biden and President Felipe Calderon.
Right here. Hey guys.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. President, we should be very flattered. It's a beautiful sunny day out there, and you're here.
That's good.
They probably required to be here to see us, but Folks, we're lucky today. I go back a long way. We overlap. I was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee for the first couple years that the president was president, and then vice president for the remainder of your time in office. And it was an enormous, enormous pleasure working with you and getting to know you. As President Gutman said, our hearts go out to all the Mexican people who have, particularly those who were caught in the earthquake. It is a tragic, tragic situation. Thank God, not as many deaths as the last one that was took over thousands of lives. But nonetheless, there are well over 300 dead, and the families, and it ripples through the entire country. And I want you to know that we're very proud of, I'm told that there's a group here you got to speak to a little bit earlier, the Mexican students here at the University of Pennsylvania, and they went out and raised a good deal of money for that recovery.
Thank you.
Did you enjoy hanging out with them?
Yes, this is
Okay.
it. Yeah,
Well,
thank you.
Well, they're pretty excited that you're here. We're all excited that you're here. I have a great privilege. Last time I sat in the stage, President Gutman asked me all the questions. Now I get to ask the questions here, and this is really, I'm looking forward to this. I didn't realize the Penn Biden Leaders Dialogue would allow me that opportunity. But I should, in full disclosure, the President and I had a great long lunch together earlier, reacquainting ourselves with one another, and we had a great time. And I hope you learn as much today from the President as I did in my conversations with him. Particularly, I hope my niece, who's in the vet school, and my nephew, who is on the rugby team, and my granddaughter, who's a freshman. There will be a quiz, a Biden family quiz, after this is over. All right.
Good.
But Mr. President, this is the first in it's the inaugural Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement planning that we have. We're going to formally announce in January. But this Leaders Dialogue is something that we're flattered you would be the first to come.
Thank you, sir.
The President and I agreed at lunch. We enjoyed being with one another so much, we decided we should do this anyway, privately. But at any rate, so I'm going to get to ask you some questions, but I'd like to ask you if you'd like to make any opening comments to the students.
Well, first, I just want to express my gratitude for your words for the Mexican people. Thank you, Madam President. It has been a very difficult moment for our people. As you were saying, 350 people died in the earthquake, and hundreds of buildings in Mexico City have been damaged, and thousands of houses have been lost. However, the good news is from the debris has emerged an incredible, strong new generation of Mexicans, quite a strong sense of new citizenship that I hope that it could be able to build the new Mexico we need, a new Mexico bolder, stronger, with more sense of responsibility, and I'm very sure that all those young people will take the future of the country in their hands. So the good news is that a new Mexico is coming, and thank you for your solidarity. And of course, thank you for all the Mexican students here at Penn University collecting a lot of money.
How many Mexican students are here? Raise
50.
your hand. There you go.
Right. Good. 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 And I would say that they had collected more than $50,000, but we need much more, isn't it? Please, we count on your collaboration with the Mexican people through the Mexican students here. Oh?
I want to point out they're the only students in coats and ties here. I just wanted to make that. So they're showing great respect for you, Mr. President. Mr. President, you and I discussed this at lunch, and I've been spending a lot of time, as you have, going around the globe, and there's this idea that has served us so well after World War II, this liberal world order that was put in place that allowed, I would argue, for the incredible prosperity we have witnessed here in the United States, and the basic stability that it's given the world is being challenged everywhere. It's being challenged in Europe, it's being challenged in Asia, and the notion that and in Mexico.
US.
And this impulse toward, in this age of populism, nationalism, the impulse to pull inward, the impulse to blame whatever is the ill of the moment on, quote, the other, is something that we've talked about. What do you consider, Mr. President, the greatest threats to our global order now? And how do you think we go about best addressing these threats?
Well, one is, as it was mentioned this morning, of course, this streaming towards nationalism, populism, inwards looking, it's threatening the international order. And but we need to address the issue first, understanding what exactly is happening. The first problem is people are suffering everywhere, are suffering from economic changes, are suffering from unemployment, are suffering from lack of income. These kind of problems are provoking a lot of fears, and people feel under threat. And it's very easy for any unresponsible politicians to find some scapegoat and blame someone else about those problems. And what is happening everywhere is a lot of problems. One is, for instance, changes in technology, automation, for instance, which is displacing a lot of people with not enough skills. But it's easier to blame either the Mexicans or the Chinese, either products or people, about the problems of the society. And that is provoking this global threat to the international order, meaning for that, an order built upon common rules, principles, values. And this risk of global isolation will take first a lot of authoritarian regimes everywhere, which is happening already in Latin America, for instance, in Venezuela. And also it's weakening our common capacity to address global problems. If we try to look beyond the global problems we are facing today, either terrorism, for instance, or climate change, we cannot address those problems without the sense of community, without the sense of global effort to address them. But if we destroy the global institutions, we cannot overcome those problems. So manipulation of the people is provoking that, but also we need to understand that there are real problems among the people that we need to understand and try to talk about it. We need to explain to people what exactly is happening. We need to fight a battle, and we need to win the battle in public opinion in order to avoid those scapegoating attitudes and strategies. And maybe we are failing on that, Mr. Vice President.
Well, I think in each of our countries, to some degree, we're failing in that. You know, there are a lot of folks, as we talked about at lunch, who are frightened, who are scared, with good reason. It's not all made up. These students are going to see more change in the next 15 years than you and I have seen in the last 50 years. And with digitalization, Moore's Law, the concern about and the opportunities related to artificial intelligence, there's a lot of folks out there in the United States and in Mexico, but I find in Europe and around the world, who wonder what future they're going to play. For example, Mr. President, I keynoted Davos 2 years ago, the World Economic Forum, and I was asked by a fellow you know, Klaus Schwab, who runs it, would I deliver a speech on the fourth industrial revolution? Will there be a middle class? And I think we all, you and I talked about at lunch, we all take at our risk, our own risk, if we don't understand that there are good, hard-working, God-fearing people out there who are really worried about will there be a future for them. And toward that end, one of the things that concerns me the most, and I'd like your view on it, is that some rhetoric, and sometimes we even hear it in my country, there is, instead of deciding what we can do together, everything is becoming a zero-sum game. America wins, America first, the rest of the world loses. The rest of the world, some other country, quote, wins, we lose. Does it have to be that way?
Absolutely not. But the problem is we have not been able to explain to people the benefits of such kind of cooperation. For instance, one clear example is related with trade. This zero-sum game that is pretended to be explained behind the trade is completely false. The trade is able to provide benefits either for consumers, for producers, for buyers, or sellers. It is not true that the trade is only in the benefit for sellers, for instance. It's completely false. But we need to explain that whenever we have trade, we are able to expand the economic growth among all the players. We can get clear economic benefits for consumers, but also we can get economic benefits for producers. Jobs, workers, both sides of the equation are gaining along the trade is gaining and expanding economic benefits for all. But we have been involved in this rhetoric in which trade is bad, for instance, for importers, which is absurd. That trade is bad, for instance, in terms of deficit. I remember the president of Argentina, Cristina Fernandez. We were exporting Passats and Volkswagen vehicles to Argentina. And she wanted it should be like a net trade, no deficit between us. And I say, well, President, we are unable to buy soccer players from Argentina, one soccer player for each vehicle we are exporting there, no? It's impossible to buy Mendoza's wine bottles or whatever. For each vehicle.
I was never able to speak to her that way.
Right. But the point is that we need to understand and we need to start like a new way to battle this, to fight this battle, Mr. President. We are losing, by the way. It's easy for the people to believe that you are the bad guy because you are exporting, or you are the bad guy because you have some kind of surplus. It's an economic basis in which we are losing the battle. We need to re-educate to say that, or to win this cultural battle.
Well, the President and I thought, and so did the Clinton administration, that one of the things you have to do in trade is you have to be in a position where your policies help the country with whom you're trading that seems to have an advantage because of low wages. We have to provide a circumstance where the economy grows in that country. But one of the things you've been a leader on is on the environment. When you left office, you took on a very serious responsibility in the United Nations. You helped lead the world in focusing on this. I remember when we first started and how things have changed through your leadership, both as president and in absence of and since you've been president. And that is that for the longest while we were taught if we wanted to really engage in free trade and be fair to other countries we were trading with at the same time, we couldn't hold each country the same environmental standard. But talk to me about your view about how that is emerging. I remember, to be very specific, Delaware used to be, when I was a senator, a major automobile manufacturer. There's no automobile plants left in Delaware now, but it had the highest percentage of auto workers in the country because we had a small population and a large number. And remember when NAFTA went through, which I supported, the limitations on requirements of the same environmental standards were different in that agreement. And I remember how the auto workers were very angry because in Delaware they had to spend $180 million to put containment vessels on top of the paint shop so we wouldn't be polluting, and it didn't have to in Mexico. But as your economy has grown, there's been a greater demand, hasn't there?
And actually, I completely agree with raising the standards for environmental issues, definitely. I don't accept to sacrifice human health or environment in terms of economic benefits. And actually, I believe that we need to address all these issues regardless the country or regardless the level of development. I don't believe that being a very poor country, you have the right to pollute and kill people in some way, which is a very false argument right now. I'm completely against that. I believe, actually, what we need to do is to change this idea, Mr. Vice President. When you observe what is happening everywhere in terms of climate, when you have these terrible hurricanes, one of them, Joe, by the way, I don't want to be offensive with that, Joe, but Irma and
my fighting ability.
Harvey, Irma, Carla, I don't know, but all of them in the Atlantic this time, devastating. Puerto Rico is completely devastated, and Cuba, and a lot of Iceland in the Caribbean Sea. When you see all those damages, and you understand that it's clearly a correlation between global emissions, global warming, and when you have changes in the temperature, you can clearly understand that there are a lot of changes in the climate. The reason why we are not taking action is because there is a general idea that taking action on climate change implies huge economic sacrifices, which is exactly the idea behind all those negotiations that being responsible with the environment could damage the investment. That is not true. It's completely a false dilemma, and we demonstrated in the Global Commissions on the Economy and Climate that it is possible to have economic growth and to create jobs and reduce poverty, and at the same time to tackle climate change. It is possible to get a responsible attitude with climate and at the same time a responsible attitude with development. But we need to act right now and to change a lot of systems that are behind that. But going to your question, it's a false dilemma, and we need to fight and defend the environment at the same time to fight and defend the economic growth. That is possible.
I think it's what you just heard is very important, because there's a notion out there. There's a notion out there, and it was, remember when the meeting was taking place, Tony, in Seattle, 5, 6, 7 years ago, that it was inappropriate for powerful nations to insist on environmental standards, that was a way to subjugate poor nations, et cetera, no opportunity. But you know, Secretary Blinken is with me today. He's up here at Penn, and as the #2 guy at the State Department. But when I remember when the President and the Secretary and I and a few others were in the Oval Office talking about could we get China to cooperate. And my argument was that all you have to do is go to Beijing and see people riding around with masks on and realize the number of deaths that are occurring in China to realize that China's interest was overwhelmingly to have a cleaner environment. And ordinarily, you would have thought China, being a, quote, a developing country, would be much more. But the biggest ally the President found in getting to Paris was Xi Jinping.
Well, because the world is changing as well. I remember that I attended the Copenhagen conference, the COP19, I suppose. I remember that, and sorry, COP15. And it was a complete failure. I remember President Obama attending, and Hu Jintao, and a lot of people there, almost 100 leaders of the world, and we failed. And it was terrible because I was going to be the next president chairing a COP in Cancun in 2010. So when I received the flag or the banner for that, I said, oh my God, I felt very sad. What am I going to do? I felt myself like, I don't know if you ever seen these cartoons, the Roadrunner, and I felt like the coyote with the bomb in my hands, no? Acme brand. And suddenly I said, well, what is going to happen there? So I went with China and talked with Hu Jintao then. I said, Mr. President, China it should not be blamed about this terrible failure, and you are, in the eyes of everyone, you are guilty for that. And said, well, the Americans are guilty for that. And it was a finger-pointing attitude always. But suddenly, the Chinese team told me, well, the Chinese people, the government, is doing a lot in favor of the environment. We are planting millions of trees. We are changing dramatically to renewable energy. It was a surprise to me, I need to confess. But I said, well, if that is true, why you are not cooperating? And they told me, because we don't want to be supervised by the Americans or by any imperialist country. We don't want all those commissions. We don't want all those binding commitments at that time. I said, well, let's do this. You can put your own commitment without foreign supervision. Put your own commitment in the table. And I will consider that you will keep your word. And that's the origin in Cancun of the national commitments, which actually was the origin of the NDCs in Paris. So the reason for the success is we changed the old idea of making bilateral or multilateral treaties in order to put in place some kind of unilateral national commitments. So China became a very key actor. And I don't believe at the beginning, Mr. Vice President, that China had, at that time at least, a clear commitment against climate change. My conclusion is, one, is reputational factor. Chinese government is avid to be considered like a big player in the new order, a responsible leader. Second, the most important political problem for the Communist Party is air pollution.
You got it, and corruption.
Berlin, but air pollution, corruption. But the people in Beijing, for instance, is completely angry about air pollution. And if somebody told me that watching the Chinese social net, because they have no Twitter or Facebook, they have their own nets, people were really angry about that. So they needed to change the attitude of polluting about coal and other energy, power generation, and they are switching all the way to renewable energy. So China became a very key factor. So the world is changing, and regardless the responsibility or the lack of responsibility of some leaders in the world is moving in the right direction, and will keep doing so.
I know why we get along, because we are both cockeyed optimists. But for real, one of the things, there's enormous opportunity in the chaos that we're facing out there. Enormous opportunity. And as the president knows, President Obama always kidded me because I'd say reality has a way of intruding. In my long discussion with Xi Jinping, who I've spent more time with than any world leader, I have over 25 hours of private dinners with him, one of the things he's concerned about, he has a gigantic problem. No matter what the ideology of a government and or the people are, nobody, whatever their background is, wants pollution where they cannot breathe free air, drink clean water, and nobody wants to be taken for granted by having a kleptocracy as their government and or rampant corruption. You cannot sustain your leadership with those two things moving rampantly, which takes me to a different place. Let's get back to talking about this populism. Populism, in my view, is, the thesis is that populism is designed to go out and help all those folks who are just ordinary people, who don't have a fighting chance, etc. But almost always it's been used by charlatans to aggrandize power and amass power. And one of the things I'm finding is that in order to deal with breaking down the world order, I believe one of the biggest threats to the liberal world order is Vladimir Putin. I think Putin has been very, very targeted with one overwhelming desire. I don't think he's trying to rebuild, I like your opinion, rebuild the Soviet Union, reconstitute it. But what he wants to do is, if he breaks up NATO, breaks up the EU, if he breaks up the institutions built up after World War II, which are all designed to limit power and prevent the abuse of power, then he deals with a number of medium-sized states, and the only state in the country has to worry about in the world is the United States. Whereas if there's a coherent NATO, if there's a coherent Europe, whole, free, and at peace, that presents a great dilemma to him. And so I'll give you one example. When we were working with Ukraine to deal with and Romania about their energy problems, I think something you know a great deal about. All of a sudden, I found out that one of the biggest contributors to the Green Party in Romania was Russia.
Oh.
They had that they call in Southern Europe, they had an altar call. They saw the Lord. But everything that's being done now, whether you take a look at Russia or to some extent China, some extent Iran, which others, the idea is to have coherent international organizations. Makes it more difficult for countries who want to expand their spheres of influence to be able to do so.
Yeah, one of the problems of disappearing or weakening the international order is that that kind of vacuum presents an incredible opportunity for such kind of authoritarian person or expansionist strategies. One of the reasons is that, well, Putin, it's a man with a lot of talent, we need to say, very few values, to say the least. The problem is that he has been able to survive in a context of the last decade, from 2000 to 2011 probably. The price of commodities went up dramatically. Being a country exporting oil and natural gas, depending heavily on that, of course, this windfall provided an incredible economic platform for the expansionist project of Putin. He pretends to rebuild probably not the Soviet Union, but the Tsar age of Catherine the Great or something like that. It looked like the new Peter the Great. But the point is, as you were saying, strong international institutions, NATO or others, are able to prevent and deter all those expansionist efforts. So the problem is when you allow to weaken those institutions, NATO in particular, they can catch the opportunity very easy.
And they're doing it now in Europe.
Look at this, what happened in Crimea. I remember overnight the Russians just took over Crimea. I remember one of your fellow members in the government of President Obama, he was working in CIA and told me, he was working in the Army Forces. He told me, well, I was working with diplomacy, trying to persuade all the time the Russians that the presence of American troops in Europe don't represent any threat for the Russians. We spent years and years talking with the Russians about that. And suddenly, they realized that in 15 minutes, because after Crimea, nothing happened with the Russians, and nothing happened because there was not any American reaction in talking about armed forces. Russia is able to expand its power. This guy, crazy guy in North Korea, is able to threaten everyone, and Maduro in Venezuela is able to kill his own people because the weakness of international order allows that. And the problem is we have serious efforts to ignore and abandon international order. I cannot forget, for instance, in this context, the promise of a candidate in the last American election. I cannot remember his name, but he promised to say, well, I don't want to collaborate with NATO anymore. No, there is no sense. I will abandon the American bases in South Korea. I will destroy the international order because I don't care about international order. Well, when you see the consequences, and the consequences are not only Crimea or only Ukraine, the consequence is there is a country named Russia that was able to intervene and maybe decide a very important part of the most important national act of one nation, which is the election. Of course, the people maybe...
You're not suggesting that Russia interfered with our election.
No, not at all, please, no. No.
My God, I'll have to leave the stage if you say that.
But that is happening.
Well,
if there was another country, maybe the people in this country could react in a dramatic way. But as long as a lot of people finally voted and voted for him, people are not reacting. But it's a scandal. One country intervening in its traditional opposite, or I don't know what to say that. I don't want to say enemy, but
Well, look, the people who benefit, the nations who benefit by the dissembling of this world order are the people who are primed and designed to be able to increase their prospect of abusing the power they have against other countries, against their own citizens. And so you see you saw what's happened in Europe. One of the things, as you know, we've talked about it, I've been fairly outspoken in our administration and since, and even with some little disagreement within our administration, that the United States had an obligation to insist that Europe maintain sanctions against Russia in Ukraine, that we spent a lot of money, about over $3 billion so far, in guaranteed loans and others to actually train, increase the capacity of the Ukrainians. But underlying all of that was the need. I spend most of my time, as you know, Mr. President, with the president, Poroshenko, and Yatsenyuk, leader of his party, and in forcing them to, pushing them, but actually making it clear that we would not be engaged unless they actually went in and began to take care of the endemic corruption that existed there. Because it seems to me, Mr. President, there are several new tools that are being able to be honed and used very well in foreign policy in the toolkit that is usually made up of diplomacy and force, et cetera, and that is the corruption, oligarchs, and the threat of using raw materials as weapons. And so what's happened is that, fortunately, we've been able to keep Europe together on this point, but then what's happened with with Brexit, what's happened with this rise of populism and nationalism within Europe, it's very unsettling, and it provides genuine openings for Russia to further destabilize. You know, the dream you and I had in our generation of leadership has been a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Mm-hmm. Because when that occurs, it gives a platform for us to be able to conduct our foreign policy and have consensus around the world. And you see what's happening in Romania. You see what's happened in Hungary. You see what's happening even in Poland now, where this populist theme has really opened up a fissure, giving significant opportunity for Putin and Russia to further sort of shave off elements of support and stability in Europe. And so I guess my question is, let's come home. Let's talk about U.S.-Mexican relations. In our administration, I made a speech early on saying it is we, the Obama-Biden administration, no longer look to the hemisphere, Latin America and Mexico in particular, as what we can do for the region, but what we can do with the region.
Fantastic. Yeah.
And I found that one of the things we had to overcome with some justification was the sense that we were going to impose our will, that we, the United States, were going to continue some modern-day form of gunboat diplomacy. But your leadership, ending in 12, set the stage for an emergence of a new relationship. And for a while there, up till now, I've been very, very hopeful about that relationship. Your economy has grown significantly in the last 15 years. The economic stability. I noticed I was doing a conference on migration in Guatemala, and Mexico's foreign minister was there, and I found it fascinating. The complaint was, the southern border of Mexico is porous now, and all these people are coming across. What he was saying was they weren't staying on the train and going to the United States, they were staying in Mexico. And all of a sudden we had what we Catholics call an epiphany. It was like, oh my Lord, maybe this is interesting because of increased stability, increased economic opportunity.
Well, a very important part of that is I believe that having a good understanding and cooperation between our countries is the right way to go. And actually, that new era that we tried to build between the United States and Mexico is one based upon the mutual confidence and trust. And we were able to overcome a past of lack of confidence and finger-pointing attitude. So we got a lot of cooperations. We were able to build together a lot of things. Let me say something. One is, it's not easy to talk about it, for instance, national security. We reached an incredible stage of national security issues cooperation between the United States and Mexico. For instance, we in Mexico seized a terrorist who was plotting to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. We were able to trap or to stop the expansion of Iranese intelligence agents in Mexico because they were expanding the Iranian embassy in Mexico in an incredible way. We were able to save a lot of lives here in the States and in Mexico working together, just talking about national security. Maybe the problem is for a lot of people here in the States and for some people in current government, they are taking Mexico for granted in terms of national security. Or they just ignore how much Mexico is doing in favor of the national security of the Americans. But if one day Mexico decides to withdraw such cooperation, which is not a rational decision for anyone, but there will be a lot of troubles here. The other is what implies, we know, of course, what implies the United States for Mexico. Nobody ignores such reality. But what is interesting is to ask ourselves, what does Mexico mean for the United States? And just talking, for instance, about trade. The trade with Mexico implies 6 million jobs for American families. Just only exporting goods to Mexico implies 1.1 million of American jobs, directly. And actually, the trade implies that the United States are the most, or could be the most competitive and prosperous nations as long as it's able to cooperate in the region in order to get combined sources of competitiveness, including investing and trading with Mexico. You were talking about manufacturing companies, automotive industry in your state, and yes, but it's clearly that the level of development of the United States related with the income per capita in the state, which is completely different from Mexico, implies the aggregated value here is completely different. The kind of jobs are more oriented towards services, intelligence, software, for instance. The less developed country, the less aggregate value produced. There are a lot of countries in Mexico producing apples, the fruit. But of course, you can get much more aggregate value and money producing apples, the computers. And that is the reality of the trade. That is the reality of the integration. The American companies, car industry, Ford Motor Company, GM Company, Chrysler, they were into bankruptcy, Chapter 11, Chapter 9, during the crisis. They were able to survive and preserve the American jobs here because they have plants in Mexico. Otherwise, they should not survive. So we need to understand that the new global reality allows the regions to be very competitive. So we need to understand what Mexico implies for the United States. And one last thing, tourism. You can cancel the visas for Mexican people. But we, the Mexicans, are 1 out of 4 tourists in the United States. We are one of the most fascinated visitors to the US. And if you consider, for instance, how much money we spend in the States compared to how much money the Americans spend in Mexico, the Americans spend like 16 billion a year in Mexico. We, the Mexicans in the States, spend 20 billion a year in the United States. A lot of jobs for American people. We are the second largest buyers of American products in the world. We, the Mexicans, buy more products than China, Japan, and the UK combined. We love the American products. I don't know why, but we love the American products. And we need to understand that only together could be more powerful, only together could be stronger, only together can prosper. Being enemies, like before, or distant neighbors, is not a solution for anything.
You got me sold. Look, as you know, Mr. President, just speaking for former President and myself, we set about to fundamentally change the relationship permanently with Mexico. I, with the President's authorization, made a number of major speeches and spent an awful lot of time in Mexico and in Latin America, talking about how I believe that Mexico maybe is among the first 3 priorities the United States has to determine whether or not we succeed in the 21st century. And it relates to everything from security to trade, but to cooperation in terms of affecting the hemisphere. I believe if you take a look, if you were my great-grandchildren, when they're here at this school, hopefully, writing their senior thesis about the period of time you and I served, I hope they will talk about, for real, about it was the beginning of the change where the Western Hemisphere became the most dominant hemisphere in the world. If you think about it, we're in a position in this hemisphere for the first time in as long as it's existed to see from the Arctic to the Antarctic a hemisphere that is middle class, at peace, secure, and incredibly productive. And for me, and the President agrees, President Obama agreed, for me, the key to that is, first and foremost, our relationships with Mexico. Now, let me take you to a slightly different place. I spent a great deal of my time and my political capital on the Hill with Democrats and Republicans, and because they took my word for it, it worked. We came up with a significant commitment to help change the governance in the Northern Triangle, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Because if you think, the way we think about it is sort of a bottleneck to prevent, that's presently preventing both a figurative and a literal highway from our southern border to Brazil. And so one of the things that's happened is that we've worked very closely with the Mexican government to try to literally engage in changing the governance structures in those countries so they bring stability, generate a significant reduction in corruption, and cooperation. For example, the possibilities of energy as, those 3 countries have some of the most expensive energy costs in the world. Yeah. Yet they're sitting next to a gigantic producer and another producer just north of them. Yeah. And so talk to me about what you think could be done in us working in conjunction with one another to actually begin to change the fundamental structure of the relationship from the southern border down to Colombia, that whole area?
Well, it's a very complex region anyway. Well, I agree with you that Latin America, the whole continent of America, has tremendous possibilities for growth, development, and prosperity. However, if you allow me to pick one single problem, one single challenge we need to overcome in the region, will be rule of law. And that includes Mexico, but also Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and a lot of countries in the region, Venezuela, of course, and a lot of them. And what is happening? When you are not able to enforce the law, when you have a government that doesn't want to keep the law, to enforce the law, to observe the law, you can see most of the problems we have related with governance. One expression of the lack of rule of law is corruption, as you were saying, because the law is ignored by governments or companies or people. And the other aspect of the lack of rule of law is the lack of security. And we have a serious problem in Mexico and several regions. And Central America, you can see terrible things. Honduras became probably San Pedro Sula, the worst case in terms of security for a city in the world. The whole country had like 80 homicides per 100,000 people, the highest in the world. Now it's Venezuela, by the way, but the problem is we need to build the institutions we need for the future. Let me tell you a tale. I tried to change that. I tried to change the law enforcement institutions and agencies in Mexico, and we got a lot of success at federal level with the support and cooperation of the American agencies. And for instance, we established the vetting process for new federal police with Mexico, and we tried to do that the same in the Attorney General offices and so on. But there was a moment in which I tried to pass a law in order to apply the very same standards and the very same vetting processes for local police corporations and for local general attorney offices. And then there was some kind of protest coming from the governors. And I remember I was seated with all the governors. We have a very unfair Federal Council of Security because we need to reach agreement by consensus. And it's quite difficult to get the right consensus when you have 32 governors against one president. Any one of them has the veto to deter any measure. So suddenly one governor said, Mr. President, first I want to say that we admire your courage and so on, but second, with all respect, what the president is pretending to do is the president believes that, or he wants to have a police corps like in Switzerland. And we are not Switzerland, we are Mexico. We have our own tradition, we have our own values, we have our own way to fix the things, no? We are a poor country and blah, blah, blah. And the other guy say, well, you know, I agree with my fellow governor. I tried to establish the vetting process in my own state, and most of the policemen are not approving that. If I need to fire them, they are going to go directly to crime. I say, don't miss the point, Governor. You have a serious problem of security in your own state. If your policemen are not approving the exams, they are not going to go to delinquents. They are already collaborating with crime. But they are using our weapons, they are using our cards, they are using our documents, and the information we get from the people. And Governor, I told the other one, I don't accept that this naive to pretend to clean the police members. But assuming that if I want to provide for your own citizens a police corporation keeping the highest standards in the world, and I will provide federal funds for that, what exactly is your problem? At the end, I lost the consensus. They won. And that governor and his policemen were the policemen that kidnapped and probably killed the students in Guerrero, the 43 students of Ayotzinapa. And the problem is, I remember these days, and I will say, what can we do in order to change our countries and to make our countries a rule of law countries? And I say, maybe what that governor told me that day, you pretend to have a police like in the first world. And yes, we need policemen, we need attorney general offices, we need judges according with the highest standards the Mexican people deserve. And we need to fight for that. It doesn't depend on the oil, it doesn't depend on natural resources, it doesn't depend on the American tourists. We depend on our capability to strengthen our legal institutions. Our future depends upon our capability to make our country rule of law countries, and that is the same for Mexico, that is the same for Guatemala, for Honduras, for El Salvador, and for a lot of countries that are suffering a lot. If we are able to keep the law, we will guarantee investment. If we are able to keep the law, there is no one tourist afraid to be kidnapped or stolen or extorted in Mexico. If we are able to keep the law, our people will prosper, and we need to do so. So going after these comments to your question, Mr. Vice President, your support, and I talk about yourself, but also the American government last administration, not only President Obama, I need to say, I received understanding and support from President Bush at the beginning, has been very important, and we need to build new institutions. I don't accept that Mexico and other countries are condemned to be third countries for all the time. I don't accept to be qualified like a poor country, poor Mexican. They never understand, they never prosper. I believe that Mexican people have the courage, have the capabilities, have exactly the hope to transform the reality, but we need from the government and for the international community is a way to strengthen the law enforcement agencies and institutions in Mexico. That's the way to prosper in the region, including Mexico as well.
And Mr. President, to some degree, Mexico suffers on that score from having very significant national resources, oil. I'm one of the guys who put together Plan Colombia years ago. And Colombia does not have the natural resources that Mexico has. And Colombia is desperately in need of development funding and a range of other things. I remember going down and being in Bogota when I think it was the Cali cartel went in and into the Supreme Court and assassinated people sitting on the bench. And so part of what we said back then, it's a long while ago, we said, if you want our help, you've got to let us come down and set the FBI up to vet your local police if you want any help. Otherwise, you're on your own. Well, they did. Now, Colombia ranks well above a number of countries, including Mexico, in terms of diminished corruption. Now, what we did in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, serious problems. We came up with what will be well in excess of $1 billion. There's a lot of money in those small countries. And we said, we will, in fact, provide, and there are very specific things we're saying. If you do this, we will do specifically that. And it includes reforming their court system, vetting their police officers, and a whole range of other things that relate directly to fundamentally changing their governance structures. Because we're of the view that if, in fact, ordinary people are able to turn on a light switch and the light actually goes on, that they're more likely to continue to be enlightened, no pun intended, on all the other things that make for a decent life, including education and a range of other things. But here's the deal. One of the things that is, there is a new sort of law of, the laws of physics, Well, there's emerging sort of laws of physics for economics. Nobody is investing in a country any longer that is corrupt. Nobody's investing in a country that doesn't take advantage of all the resources, including women. And as that old expression goes, women hold up half the sky. No one is investing in places, not because the United States tells them not to, but because they don't want to be victimized. They don't want to be used. And so I'm finding the strongest tool I had to get some of the changes that were beginning to take place, with the help of Mexico, I might add, in Honduras and El Salvador, and is that the changes are brought about out of necessity. The business community is finding that we're no longer prepared to help them unless they're prepared to invest in their own countries. They're not prepared to invest in their own countries until things get a little bit better. So institution building seems to us to be the key to begin to develop a culture, in a governing culture in the countries you've talked about, where there is more opportunity and more investment across the board, not just in economic investment, but education and public safety. And one of the things that is starting to happen, and I hope we continue it, I hope this administration doesn't walk away, is that we made some very firm commitments. In order to get money, you must do A, B, C, or D, your decision. As I met with all your former presidents, the folks you work with, I sit down and say, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just telling you, if you want our help, this is the condition on which we'll help you. And things are beginning to change, even a little bit in the Caribbean. But I don't want to leave here. We're down to 5 minutes here. Matilda, a Penn student, a senior major in international relations, asked the question, should NAFTA be renegotiated? And how do you envision future, not past, Mexican-American trade relations?
Well, I would prefer to not reopen NAFTA, because it's like a Pandora box. No? NAFTA, a new agreement should almost be approved by Mexican Senate, American Congress, Canadian Parliament. And you know very well, Mr. Vice President, the number of interests, some of them vested interests around such a negotiation. So I think if we have an agreement, and it has been better to keep like that. However, the negotiation is open, and we need to try to keep the best negotiation. However, I do prefer, in the worst case scenario, to deter all this nationalism and all those visions that will ruin the trade, is not working. I prefer to, in the extreme, to withdraw NAFTA in this sense. If the renegotiation doesn't take us to our affordable and positive field, we should not renegotiate it. We can't embrace the WTO rules, the World Trade Organizations, as long that could keep better or clearer rules for anyone. Now, saying that, I would say that in any case, I can see in the future, either with NAFTA renegotiated or reloaded, even not as good as we have today, I don't believe that something better is going to come from the negotiation. Or according with WTO rules, I can see that the trade between the United States and Mexico will continue. We are trading like 1.5 billion a day between our countries. That is impossible to stop. Even if you raise tariffs, for instance, according with the textbook on economics, that could pass through all the way either to rate of exchange or some changes in the margin of the demand, but the trade will be there. Our nations are linked, and it is impossible to stop the trade by decree, and that is going to happen. So in the future, I can see NAFTA, or I can see the trade beyond NAFTA. I hope that our people will do the right job. I believe that the American negotiator, the real professional people in the government, know the top voices of that, but those guys understand how important it is to get a good treaty or a good agreement between us, and I hope that that could prevail. But in the worst case scenario, if the American president withdraws NAFTA, we have the WTO rules, and with them, we will preserve the trade. And even changing the rules, the trade will be there, and it's better to have clear rules for anyone. We need to remember that NAFTA is good for the Americans, it's good for the Mexicans, it's good for Canadian people. NAFTA is good for American workers, NAFTA is good for Mexican workers. And even though, assuming that NAFTA could be a little bit better or much better for Mexican people, the worst thing to do in order to deter immigration from Mexico is to stop NAFTA. The only way in which we have been able to stop immigration of Mexican workers, because this is some very important data, the net immigration of Mexican workers to the United States reached to 0 in 2010 and currently is negative. There are more people going back to Mexico than people coming back from Mexico to the United States, for good and bad reasons, but that isn't true. If we're going to re-engine the Mexican immigration, we need to stop the prosperity of Mexico, and the best way to do that is to stop NAFTA. It's a stupid thing. One guy proposing to stop immigration, but at the same time, it's a paradoxical. No? Somebody wants to stop immigration. I'm promising that. But at the same time, doing everything in order to foster immigration from Mexico. That's incredible. No? Wow. So I see the future will be with trade and prosperity for both. Believe me, Mr. Vice President, I respect politics, foreign politics and politicians as well, but you have a president, I respect that, but believe me, when Mr. Trump ends his presidency, Mexico and Mexican people will be there. He is gone, and we will be there.
Well,
we'll be gone.
Mr. President, before it comes up to end this, and we're 50 seconds over, perfect timing, I'm going to exert the privilege of the chair here and say two things. Number one, there is over $500 billion in trade a year right now. And one of the premises of our view is, most of us do not view prosperity as a zero-sum game. The more prosperous our neighbors are, the better off we are. I remember saying to President Xi, he said, "Why do you keep wishing us to have greater prosperity?" I said, "So we can sell you our goods." Because one of the great things, and it's one of the things your present government and your government wanted to talk about, and this is going to sound chauvinistic, but the most innovative country in the world remains the United States of America, by far and away. We have more great research universities in this country than all the rest of the world combined. That is not hyperbole. Every other country in the world combined does not have as many great research universities as we do. We also have a great advantage. We have worker replacement because of immigration. It is a gigantic asset to us. And one of the things I proposed when we first got elected, Mr. President, that all these brilliant Mexican students that are here at the university, those of you who receive a PhD, I want to make sure, not a joke, as you walk across the stage at the University of Pennsylvania, you get a diploma and a 7-year green card. We want you to stay. No, because we talked about this. that is not in Mexico's interest, but there are more Mexican PhDs in the United States of America than in all of Mexico. And it's one of the reasons why we are so very prosperous. The last point I'll make, Mr. President, is, and it's always great to be with you, and we're going to do more of this, you and I, but one of the other things is that if you think about why the United States has prospered as much as it has had the great benefit, as people have said, for the last 100 years of having two oceans on either side of us. But also, we have had Canada to our north and Mexico to our south. Mexico should, could, and I believe will be one of America's great co-equal partners. It is overwhelmingly in the interest of the United States of America for Mexico to prosper. And like you said, Mr. President, net immigration, I mean, this idea of the image that the president and others and the other team have been advertising, it looked like you know, the image projected in America was what the image was in Croatia. A whole range of tens of thousands of folks from Iraq trying to break down barbed wire fences to cross into a country. That's not the case right now. And the value system we share is really, really critical. So, Mr. President, I hope that you and I can have our voices heard within our respective governments to make it clear that if we get it right, if we get this relationship right between Mexico and the United States, as it can be, it will be a benefit to the entire hemisphere. It will be consequential for the entire hemisphere. And that has a profound opportunity for you, Mexican students and American students. The future has such overarching potential for both our countries. I look at the position we're in now, Mr. President, as the United States being better positioned than it has been any time in my professional life or my entire life to, in a positive way, be a leader in the world. A leader in the world that will benefit the world and us greatly. And so, Mr. President, as I told you on the way over, I told you about my conversation with Lee Kuan Yew, who was, I call him, the others have too, the Henry Kissinger of Asia. He wrote extensively on the future of China, the United States, India, and Russia. And he said to me that he thought that there was no way in which the United States, if it uses its head, cannot remain the most viable power in the world, not to aggrandize power. And I told you, he asked me about what I thought about President Xi, because he asked me to stop. I was coming from Mumbai on my way to Beijing, and I had spent more time with President Xi than anyone. And this was several years, just 4 months before he died. And he asked me, he said, he wanted to know about what he was doing, because we were talking about how quickly he consolidated power in China. And midway through our conversation, I turned to him and I said, Mr. President, what is China doing now? And he said, they're in the United States looking for the buried black box. And I looked at him like you all are looking at me. I didn't quite know what he meant. And that's when that airline had gone down, remember, the Indian Ocean, never found the black box. And he said, they're in America looking for the box that contains the secret that allows America to be the only country in the history of the world that's constantly been able to remake itself. And I said, Mr. President, I'm old enough now to hazard a guess what's in that box. 2 things. One, whether you're a naturalized American citizen or native born, you are imbued with an incredible skepticism for orthodoxy. Unlike any other country in the world, whether it's Great Britain, France, any other major country in the world. That's how we make new things. We challenge old things, and we break them to make new things. I said, the second thing you'll find in that box, and this is a concluding comment, There is an unrelenting wave, not stream, of immigration into the United States of America since 1735. We have our xenophobic moments, but they always break through the know-nothing periods, and we have constant immigration. And I said, you know why that's so important? We've been able to cherry pick the best of every culture in the world. Every single culture in the world. Because a lot of people, like our president, I think there's some poor family in Guadalajara sitting around a hand-hewn table, and the father says, I got a great idea. Let's sell everything we have and give it to a coyote. He'll take us, drop us in the desert somewhere in a country that doesn't want us, where we don't speak the language. Won't that be fun? Let's go. Everybody who's come here, whether it's my Irish ancestors after the potato famine in 1849, or Russian immigrant Jews, or Africans, or anyone else, it has been because these are the people with the greatest sense of optimism, the greatest sense of purpose, the most significant courage. So you guys built this country of ours. That's who we are. And what the president, no, I didn't mean to be disrespectful. What the president, I think, doesn't understand is that the fact that in a couple years, for the first time in history, Americans of European descent like me are going to be in an absolute minority. That's our strength. Constantly new blood. Constantly new blood. That's what makes us who we are. I thank all of you for choosing Penn and choosing here, Mr. President. I'm going to try to steal them so they don't go back. But Mr. President, great having you, and thank you for everything.
Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, muchas gracias. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, and your experience with us. While we're out of time, we're certainly not out of gratitude or inspiration. To close, I'd like to invite Dr. Gutman back onto the stage to thank the President and Vice President. And in doing so, we look forward to the grand opening of the Penn Biden Center later this year. And we know that collectively, the Penn Biden Center, Perry Worldhouse, and all of us at the University of Pennsylvania can hopefully make at least a small contribution to some of the challenges we've heard talked about today. Thank you so much for being with us.